We do everything in the open, all our innovation process in the open. We obviously don't have any IP. Well, we have IP, but no protected IP. So we do all these things like totally in the open. So very, very different, I guess. I just wanted to add one thing, which I think was a little bit missing, and I'm curious to hear what the other panelists' thoughts are on this. But when we design challenges, we kind of take the term challenge very literally, and we make sure that the way we formulate these things, the way we present them to the community, are actually challenges. So they actually they inspire people to participate. So instead of going out and saying, help us write an algorithm, to make whatever history search better, we're basically creating this case of and make it exciting for people. And it's a bit like, literally the way I see this is two people in a bar challenging each other. That's kind of like the language we aim for, and it works tremendously well for us because the people are so passionate about these things then.
That's great. I'm going to ask the panel one more question based on a lot of the questions we get from agencies, and then open it up to all of you. But it's really a two-part question. How do you decide how long a challenge should run? And then how do you decide the prize? If it's a monetary prize, how do you decide what is the right amount? Or if it's a non-monetary prize, a recognition prize, how do you decide that? And Lisa, you said you don't do prizes, so let me start with you. How long do you run a challenge, or how's it structured?
Yeah, so the way our opportunities are, they generally are open until they're solved. Because we feel like if it's a critical business need that we need a solution for, then we are going to accept solutions until we get it solved. And so there's generally not a deadline. Now, some of them have deadlines because they're related to specific projects and whatnot, but in general, we don't run a whole lot of hard deadlines. And then for the compensation or the reward, it's, it's like I said, sometimes it's a technology licensing agreement if a person comes with IP that we want to license. Sometimes it's a supplier coming with a solution that we didn't know about it, and then it's simply we purchase the solution from them. Sometimes it's a contract manufacturing agreement. Sometimes there are non-monetary things that we do. You have to understand, I think, the person who's submitting the solution and understand what motivates them. For the independent inventor, sometimes the most important thing to them is that they are heard and they have a platform to share their ideas. And for a business, their most important thing is that they get a contract. And so for some companies, we have brought our resources that maybe they don't have. Part of the arrangement might be they have access to some of our marketing expertise or our graphic design expertise or things that they might not have. So it varies a lot.
Would anyone else like to address that question? Steve, I know you've run a lot of different challenges, and so how do you decide what's too much money or too little money in terms of getting people inspired?
There's sort of two questions there. I guess if you decide how long to run a challenge, it really depends on the challenge, of course. But I think fundamentally you do want to have some sort of either milestones or some sort of deadline because, first of all, business cycles sort of demand it. And then certainly, I think from the standpoint of procrastination, deadlines are good. But so there's a bunch of different ways to kind of look at these things. And from a standpoint of awards, you really have to look at what's the value of the solution. You need to look at the complexity of the problem and what is the cost of entry. Meaning, if I'm going to need a lab and a bunch of education, a PhD to kind of solve this problem, the value of that solution should go up. And then, of course, there's just a lot of experience, I think, just that probably I'm sure General Mills has figured out over time that what it takes to get people involved in a challenge, maybe a little trial and error. So those three items.
Okay. Eugene?
Well, obviously, my quick answer is obviously we're in the service business, right? So we'll do whatever our client tell us. But we found that most of the solutions could be found within 3 to 4 months, and then it takes probably another few months to have a tail of it. So our project usually run 4 to 6 months. I need to do one very important disclaimer is that I think it's impossible to come to the problem or need or challenge, whatever you call it, with the idea that you will be able to scout the earth and optimize whatever you try to do. So we trying to satisfy. So we know that, again, we almost never had a case when we couldn't find anything, that within this time frame we could find the solutions that will fit into the criteria that's been set. Of course, there is a difference between what type of, what's the internal deadlines on the client. So currently we have a client who needs to make a decision within 3 weeks. So we will run the project within 3 weeks. Obviously, in that project it will be useless to use internet or in all the electronic marketing tools because it will just not produce any results. So that's the kind of the trade-offs you need to make. So you need to know when you need the results, what kind of results, and what you'll do with them. In terms of the award, again, as we never run the competition, so there is never an award. The reason why companies are coming back to us, and the reason that I've been told by a lot of crowdsourced people that they're jealous because we're definitely not burning our crowds. The real reward for them is the potential business opportunity with the client that we're working with. And in most of the cases, they don't know who that client is until there is a real interest. So, which again, to bring the discussion, we had this conversation that it presents a challenge that how big the business opportunity is a government. NASA said in one of the challenges, well, we'll buy 1 device if it works, maybe 2 just to have one for parts. But there is other, and that's where probably the non-monetary things come in play, reputation, the stamp of approval and so far. But again, this is all beyond us. We just find the right thing, make an introduction, and whatever those 2 parties, you and the solution provider, find reasonable for you, that would be the solution.
If I could just push this a step further, I think the answer to your question, how long is long enough, depends on your assumptions about the nature of the process. And so, and I know these terms would be familiar to NASA, I think it amounts to the difference between so-called strong versus weak methods of problem solving. Weak method is guess, is you don't know where somebody is lost in the ocean, just grit it off. And unfortunately, just because they're not there doesn't mean that they're not going to be there. So one step in weak methods doesn't tell you anything about what to do next or where to look next. Strong methods, just the opposite. So obviously I believe in strong methods. So I think the answer is if you believe that, that innovation is about risk-taking, serendipity, and chance, then I think you never say never. I think if you believe that the answer is already out there, I think getting on the path is something that in that pathway has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I should also say that during the process, it seems essential that as you learn, right, pathfinding is that you're constantly refining and reframing the problem itself, right? Because what we find is, again, the answer's already out there. Well, it looked like it was sort of this was the right analogy, but no, but that helped us understand that it was more like this, which then helps us understand it's more like this. But in every step, we're triangulating. And so, again, I think as a lot of things are in life, it's what are our assumptions about something that sort of guide our beliefs and values.
Great. Let me open it up to all of you. You may have specific questions for the panelists based on their experiences, or you may have ideas for challenges that you want to run by them, or talk about industry partnerships with government, et cetera. And I can hand this microphone back for the audience.
John Allen, NASA. There's been a lot of talk about the losers, and about the losers, the ones who didn't win. Eugene, you mentioned 80% solution, sort of working at that level. Is there an opportunity for, do we have any obligation to deal with the folks who didn't win the challenges, or whatever you want to call them, to try to, when you see something positive in the work that they've done, yet it doesn't necessarily rise to the answer that you've had, to link them with other folks or find an avenue where their opportunities might be realized?
Well, as I say, in our process, again, the way, and it's not our advantage or disadvantage, that's how we positioned ourselves. We don't have losers, because if you ask specific questions that you need to, and which usually, again, we try to formulate, and you try to formulate reasonably technical. And if we're talking about the material, that we have one of the material challenges from NASA is the result is send us a sample. So this is as close as it gets, and then every technology might not work at the end. And if there is a way to, that's where the conversation starts. If it looks interesting enough, you start direct conversation with several solutions provider and see if it could be tweaked so it will work. But if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So nobody feel offended or left out. And that's one important thing, because we think, as been mentioned, it's very contact, it's very personal. We never leave any response unanswered. So we get back to them within 48 hours, and the answer might be, sorry, we have a very slow client, they only will get to that in 2 weeks. But when they get to it, we get back to them and say, sorry, your solutions didn't work, and if we can say why, we tell them, because this requirement was really important and your solution didn't meet it.
See, let me also say, forgive me for variations on basically one theme, but if something fails, I think the traditional question is, what failed? And ordinarily, what I've seen is what failed is a very specific, non-domain general, non-generic, but a very specific experiment, project, you name it, that failed. And therefore, what have we learned? All we've learned is that didn't work. If, again, we're talking about fundamental ideas, generic concepts, then failure almost always informs. It's that triangulation that I talked about, but all too often, failure is the failure of something that gives us no information whatsoever about what to do next, other than not do that again.
Probably, just to add the human component, because I think there's an interesting question about like losers, and I think it was also mentioned fatigue of your community. So from our experience, you can actually counterbalance this by treating. But first of all, like creating incentives for people to be in these things. So one of the very easy incentives is to give people a way to broadcast that they're part of this competition, even if they don't win, right? That alone is for a lot of people like a high intrinsic value. And then treat people right. I mean, like, you know, don't go out and say like this person won and like I don't talk to the losers anymore, right? What we do is like we very deliberately follow up with the losers, not winners, and basically say, hey, thank you for your contribution. You know, you didn't make it this time, and you know, here's a little like sign of gratitude from our side, which in our case is something as simple as a digital badge, which they can put on their website. So it's literally like, here is, you know, an 80 by 80 pixel graphic, which shows that you were part of our competition, which you can put on your website, and that works tremendously well for us.
Question in the second row?
This is Jason. I'm with Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And Pascal, you kind of segued to my point. There were some questions on incentive. What are your impressions of what motivates these individuals to submit ideas to these challenges? Because it seems as if they're not out to get rich. Is it for glory? Is it for bragging rights? You know, putting the logo on their website. It seems like there must be something more intrinsic, something that is more basic than something we can reward. So what are your impressions of what really motivates people to submit?
Let me tell you what the data is on this, and we've studied this. So here's what we think. Solving a problem like the ones we've been talking about, actually that solution causes the release of dopamine in your brain. So when we say love of the job, we're talking about real love of the job. It feels really good to solve one of these kind of problems. And normally, as you can imagine, it's a drug, is that feeling is such a reward, it's such a intrinsic pleasure, that itself is, I think, at the heart of a lot of the so-called intrinsic rewards, hardwired rewards. And obviously we've been rewarded for finding solutions to seemingly novel problems by connecting them in non-obvious ways to our past experience. And when we do that, which is rare, but we can all do it, we're rewarded for that. I think that's what it is. But the data on the role of intrinsic motivation, love of the job, that sort of almost evolutionary sort of reward, and extrinsic, carrot, stick, seems somewhat clear. There's still questions, but what the data seems to show is that extrinsics can rarely cause and I'm talking about creativity itself. You got to get beyond all this, because at the end of the day, some individual has got to do this. It doesn't happen in the air or the ether. It happens in someone's brain. And so I think the role of extrinsics is they can block people from innovating and being creative because they're pissed off or they're feeling victimized. But it's hard to imagine a framework in which they're causal. So if you believe that at the end of the day this is about creativity, which again is, I think, in large part analogy, how possibly could things like money affect that when the ultimate reward is the one that nature, I think, provides? And when you look at kids who are solving puzzles, and you've paid some kids to solve the puzzles, and you've given other kids, they solve them because they love doing it. And you go into the room and say, listen, we're going to stop. I want you to stop working on the puzzles for a while. And you go into the room with the kids who were paid to work on the puzzle. They've stopped working on the puzzle. And guess what happens when you go into the room and tell the kids who were working on it because they liked it to stop working? They don't stop working. They keep going. So extrinsics have a bad habit, I think, of not only not working over the long term, but often backfiring.